Hi everyone, my name is Una. Welcome to And They All Lived Happily Ever After, Utopian Construction Across Archive, Architecture and Art. So this is going to be about a 40-minute discussion and it's linked to the exhibition downstairs, and that's an exhibition that kind of reflects on the connection between the individual idealism and the practical aspects of the establishment of a new state at the time. We're going to be talking about some of the utopian ideals and narratives of both the revolutionary participants of that new state and the early architectural ambitions of the Irish Free State as it sought to find its place in the world, articulate its sense of self, its aesthetic, its ambitions through modernisation, modernism, cutting-edge design, new technologies, and that way in which Ireland was trying to find its place on the world stage. And one thing that I suppose happens in both the birth and collapse of big things is a widening of the imagination. And within that, you get all sorts of interesting, destructive, imaginative, positive ideas and everything in between. And this kind of idea of utopia, a couple of years ago, I founded a project called Utopia Ireland with Conor Habib. And we asked people one question. What is your vision of an ideal Ireland? And the breadth of answers that we receive go from the speculative to the practical to the splendid to the occasionally terrifying. And I think that demonstrates, of course, that utopian concepts and ideas of utopia are incredibly subjective, and also that people desire kind of vision, ambition, big ideas and innovation. So we're going to talk about some of those things in relation to people's areas of expertise and also in relation to the exhibition itself and its themes. We've got a lot to discuss. We're going to take some questions at the end. So if you can spend some of this time while you're listening thinking of very smart, short questions, we'll try to get to them afterwards. So our panellists this evening are our own boss, the co-artistic director of Anu Productions, Lara Joyce, the Port Heritage Director at Dublin Port Company, John McLaughlin, Associate Professor of Architectural Design at University College Cork, and Dr. Circa O'Brien, Lecturer in Design History at the Institute of Art, Design Technology in Dún Laoghaire. Let's get to the thing that people first meet when they enter this building, Owen. Tell me about the development of the exhibition and its themes and what you were trying to articulate.
Okay, I've written a piece, so I'm just going to refer to that so that I don't, So the secret space Palimpsest had its genesis decades ago when my great aunts Dora and Lily burned my great-grandfather P.T. Daly's personal papers. The loss of this archive would skew how P.T. was viewed historically. His participation in the revolutionary decade and prior to that was already a non-verbal topic within our family. It was further amplified by this loss of his voice. Of course, this made me very curious. Why was there a blockage in family oral history? A huge shame in our family was that PT had taken / stolen / misappropriated £300 of the IRB's money that he had fundraised in America. I'm not sure if shame is the right word to use, but it seems appropriate because I can actually feel it and I can actually locate it in my body. I know that there is no need to feel this over 100 years later, but it is there nonetheless. And I'm curious about how that transferred down through the generations. So Anu's decade centenary commemoration began with the lockout, as did my creative PT journey too. Chatting to my mum and my aunt about my intentions of the time, oh God, don't talk about the money was the reply. And when I came to revisit him 9 years later for the secret space, they said the same thing again. So having researched the event, there is generally one of three reasons given, or sometimes a combination of two of the three. One of his children was sick. He had a drink problem, although he was teetotal and a supporter of the temperance movement, although he was once arrested for being drunk and disorderly in Sligo. Or it was used as a fund to put Republican sympathisers in place on the city council, which was an IRB practice at the time. So PT's political rival, William O'Brien, was an avid note-taker. After his death, his personal papers were donated to the National Library of Ireland. There are 4,243 individual items held in 182 separate folders. And on the National Library of Ireland website, they state, these papers are of seminal importance to the history of the labour movement in Ireland. O'Brien used the taken/stolen/misappropriated funds as a powerful tool when both were up for election for the same position. This archival imbalance paints Daly in a very particular light. The destruction of Daly's papers provides no counterbalance to O'Brien's opinion. Some of PT's books were rescued from the fire and now live with my aunt. A passage in one of the books really caught my imagination. It was from Bat O'Connor's book With Michael Collins in the Fight for Irish Freedom. The passage related to hiding £25,000 of fundraised gold given to him by Michael Collins. Bat spent 7 hours digging the foundations of his house at 1 Brendan Road to hide the money. The gold, packed in 4 boxes and a baby's coffin, was placed in my keeping. I worked all night alone, burying the boxes beneath the concrete floor of my house in Brendan Road. Backwards and forwards I moved, wriggling like a worm upon my hip and elbow, bringing 1 box at a time, pushing it in front of me in the confined 2-foot space between the cement floor of the house and the wooden floor of the room under which I worked. The image never left me, and years later I brought it to the ANU team as the origin of a potential project, and they thought, yes, there was something in it. Also, it would turn out that our producer, Matt Smith, very fortunately was good friends with the performer Genevieve Hulme-Beeman, who was Bat's great-granddaughter. Genevieve came on board and we developed the artwork around these 2 events, the burning of PT's personal papers and the burying of the money that would eventually be used to fund an independent Ireland. With Bat being a master builder and create so many clandestine spaces for people, documents and guns and ammunition, we brought the brilliant architect Ray Moore into the process. The Secret Space was an exhibition at Project Art Centre that ran for 3 weeks in 2021. The exhibition space was activated by myself and Genevieve 5 times during that run, as we performed durationally over 7 hours on each of those days, marking the time spent by her great-grandfather under the floorboards of his house in 1 Brendan Road. We worked with performance artist Amanda Coogan to prepare for this mammoth task. On those activation days, I attempted to recreate PT's lost archive. As I typed on an old Underwood typewriter, those words were projected in real time on the wall behind me. They would then be printed from a rooftop catwalk with pages raining down on me. For the exhibition downstairs, this free writing has been gathered and bound by the National Archives senior conservator Gretchen Allen. Genevieve performed a piece she had written over the course of the 7 hours, repeatedly ascending and descending a 13-ton mound of soil we had installed. The soil mound became a metaphorical repository of all sorts of utopian potentials. The performance was captured on films which can be viewed downstairs at the exhibition. Ray's participation and Bat's life as a builder inspired me to look at the Secret Space through an architectural lens. Aligning the utopian ideals of the individual Bat and PT with the utopian ideals of new architectural forms of an emerging new nation. 2 buildings of note began to pique my interest. Ardnacrusha Power Station, opened in 1929, and the Irish Pavilion for the New York World Fair 10 years later. The former extraordinary Shannon scheme acting as a symbol of progress and power, bringing electricity to a new emerging nation. 1/5 of the country's annual budget was spent on this one resource in the world's first nationalised electrification scheme. And the latter World Fair Pavilion acting as an example to the world of an emerging new independent nation built on ancient traditions. Within our exhibition, there are documents relating to PT and Bat and to both buildings. I have attempted to create a space where individual actions sit alongside the results of those actions. The documents resonate and become implicit with the artwork. A letter stating the importance of acknowledging Ireland's independence via the hanging of the Irish President's portrait in the Irish Pavilion is reinforced by maps of the New York World Fair denoting the location of the Irish Free State Pavilion in relation to the British Pavilion. These sit alongside the draft of a speech relating to the opening of Ardnacrusha and the power being harnessed by the nation. The archives is the ideal destination for the installation. The whole project began with the loss of an archive which skewed how one person was viewed historically. How do we successfully build narratives and stories using archives in order to understand our past and ourselves in a world where truth is a valuable commodity? The upkeep and maintenance of these inheritably reliable spaces is essential.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, there's so much in what you've done and how the piece has evolved, like in this fractal way almost. And I don't know how many people saw that the piece in Project, but it really struck me how the kind of emotional architecture of the Irish psyche is often mirrored in these kind of clandestine spaces and hidden places. But I want to get to the Ard na Crusha, which forms obviously a good deal of your thinking as you kind of zoomed out. And Circa, your book, Powering the Nation, that delves very much into the Shannon hydraulic scheme. Obviously it was an initiative of huge significance, symbolic and all the rest. At the time, in terms of like architectural nationalism, let's say, how did the desires of that emerging or new or old national identity intersect with that technological aspiration?
Okay, let me think about that. Yeah, there's all sorts of things going on there, and as several of the points that Owen has been making about it, they all come up and they all come into play when you talk about Ard na Crusha, the power station as it is now, but also the Shannon scheme, the project for building it and actually constructing that, this great station or this great project. And what I'd been looking at was looking at a lot of things like the correspondence between Siemens, between the Irish government, because if anybody knows, I don't know how much anybody knows about the Shannon scheme here, is that it started in 1925. It took about 4 years to build, and it was constructed by Siemens, the German engineering company. So the Irish government the Irish government were talked into it, basically, by Thomas McLaughlin, who was a young Irish engineer who had been working for Siemens in Germany and worked on the electrification of an area called Pomerania, which is sort of on the German-Polish border now, and there had already been surveys done of the Shannon, and working with this, he worked up this notional project on paper. After the revolution, after the Civil War, he came back to Ireland and then basically sold it to the new Irish government and went, this is what we need to do. This is going to be an inspirational project. This is going to turn us into, it's going to be this new project that's going to inspire people. It's going to bring electricity to the nation. It's going to bring modernity to the nation. But we're going to have to get the German companies to come in and do it because we don't have the engineering skill or capacity. I mean, there's engineering schools, there's lots of mechanical and civil engineers in the country, but not on that scale. And what they were able to do is basically work a whole series of, there's a report done, and there's a whole series of negotiations that end up with Siemens Bau Union and Siemens Schuckertwerk. They're two Siemens companies. One is civil engineering, one is mechanical engineering. So one of them was actually building the power station, and then the other one was building the canals. And it's got this really funny setup where the building is designed by a Siemens architect called Herr Dome. I've never actually found out his first name. And the engineering work is all done by German engineers. There's about 30 or 40 of them came and lived outside in Ard na Crusha for the duration of the build. And they had several hundred skilled workers coming from Germany at different points as well. And then a huge amount of mostly unskilled workers doing things like building the canals as well, and doing things like walking from Connemara and walking from Dundalk for work, because this is the mid-1920s where good solid work is sort of short on the ground. But it's a really, really interesting building because if you look at the things that were being built in Germany at the time, there are these great big power stations. They're industrial buildings. There's no decoration on them. There's no symbolism on them at all. But they're quite geometrical in structure. They've got all these patterns of windows, but they're made out of local German red brick. And one of the things they were doing with the Shannon scheme is, okay, the plans, the drawings, they're very typical of the sort of the engineering that Siemens were doing. But they were looking at what was being constructed in Ireland and the existing buildings around the place. And they end up and said, okay, no, this has to be concrete. It has to be the grey of Irish town square buildings. I know a lot of them tend to be painted, but they're looking at that. They're putting Killaloo slate on the roof. And so they're trying to negotiate a balance between, is this industrial building, is it modernist, is it functional? But also they're thinking about where is it and the location of it. And one of the really interesting things about it is that I had found out from the research I had been doing in the National Archives, there's a whole lot of correspondence that some of it is in the National Archives here, some of it is in the Siemens archive in Germany. And you actually I managed to patch together a lot of this conversation between the engineers in the head office in Berlin, the engineers on site in Limerick, the Irish government, and then the engineers, the Irish engineers that were overseeing the project for the Irish government. It's this sort of four-way conversation going on. But loads of it is negotiated through technical drawings and plans. And they have the technical drawings here in the archive, these huge, huge drawings that every time somebody made a change, the drawing office in Berlin issued a new drawing with a new drawing number on it. And there's this huge row went on about, one of the things was about the roof of the building. Is it going to be flat or is it going to be peaked? And part of it was that the Germans actually wanted it to be the pitched roof because they were looking at the climate. And the Irish end of the story wanted it to be flat because it would be cheaper. And as Owen had said, they were already spending something like 1/5 of the national budget on this. But there's this whole very, very polite row goes on where they're sending drawings back and forth and going, no, you haven't documented that, you have to do this. And all of that archive has survived. So it's really, but there's all sorts of things, there's all sorts of things about Irish attitudes to technology at the time where there tends to be this 1920s time period, there's a lot of redefinition going on and a lot of people thinking about, well, what does it actually mean to be Irish? Also, what does it mean to be Irish 26 counties and not 32? And how are we going to define ourselves? They're designing stamps. There's the money is getting, new money as well. But also then they're looking at, where is technology in all of this? Because a lot of the associations of technology in Ireland at that particular time are, this is something that's kind of modern, it's urban, it's British, and we don't want to be modern or necessarily terribly urban, or because it's got these associations of being Britishness, so we don't want to be anyway British. We want to be Irish, we want to be rural, we want to be traditional, we want to be thinking about the west of Ireland and thinking about history in the past, and but at the same time having to look forward to the future. So there's all this sort of really nice balance, and a lot of what I was doing with that book was looking at how did they do this and how did they do it visually? And that's one of the things where I think Owen's work is really interesting, because it's that adding into that tradition of how do you negotiate these things and how do you do it in a visual way as well as a verbal one. So.
Laura, what do you think was the symbolism of the intention of such a large-scale project at the time? Was it, and what did it actually end up saying? Was it successful in, creating this vision or this utopian kind of gesture?
It was a huge statement, and it's coming out of what happened to the National Archives, the destruction of the Civil War and destruction of most of Dublin. From 1916, the War of Independence and the Civil War, you see huge destruction within Dublin. And then down in Limerick, you have this amazing construction being built. My own grandfather was the chief tour guide on it. So between the time it was being built in 25 to 29, hundreds of thousands of people went down to Limerick at the weekends to see this, because this was the marvel. So it was a huge statement. It gets overshadowed, I think, once you get into the 1930s, because you have the economic war. And then you also have a world depression in 1929. So it was an amazing statement by a young state. And then with the change of government, of course, it becomes one that the new government doesn't really want to talk about. But from an electricity point of view, the harnessing of water, and later on with the Liffey and with the Lee and the Cork dams, it provides cheap electricity in huge amounts. Ardna Crusher today, if any of you had a chance, I would this summer highly recommend you go down and do it a tour. It's still open. It's still a profitable power station. They make about 30 million euros a year that goes back into ESB headquarters. So even 100 years later, it's a hugely successful power station. So to answer your question, no, it's a hugely powerful statement. And it kind of gets overshadowed then once you go into the 1930s, and it's kind of forgotten about after that. Once the ESB is established and kind of takes over and starts building huge numbers of power stations, the peace power stations, once you get into the 40s and 50s, kind of overshadow it.
We'll go back to the kind of the clandestine in a little bit, what Owen was talking about, but in terms of like new states or the evolution of states, John, like how are other countries demonstrating or representing utopian ideals through architecture? And was the new Irish state mirroring that, or was it going on its own trajectory?
I think it had an interesting trajectory because it was a post-colonial state. And I think that was different to the normal story of modernity or modernism, which is more to do with social evolution and social revolution, particularly in, if you like, the very established powers. So it tended to be thought of in contexts like France or America or Britain or Germany, notwithstanding the vicissitudes of war, that the development of modernism and architecture, and particularly in the 20s and 30s, was very much associated with social revolution and an idea of a kind of a social agenda. And you have the same in Ireland, but it's a different, so bringing the light, as Ardna Crusher did, was about a kind of social revolution, but it has a different connotation because decolonizing countries, and I suppose Ireland's a very early decolonizer in global terms. A lot of countries, a lot of former colonies decolonized after World War II and into right up to the end of the 20th century. So there's a very interesting process that emerges, and I think the sort of typical story of the 20th century is about the big states, the big powers, and then there's a different kind of reading of that in a post-colonial situation. There's a very interesting essay by Edward Said, the great kind of post-colonial theorist, about W.B. Yeats, where he talks about this, that in the beginning of a kind of post-colonial moment or a decolonizing moment, you have to kind of reimagine the landscape when you want to kind of bring about this independence. So the landscape gets reimagined, and it's often about the distant past, the past kind of before colonialism, and hence the idea of the West of Ireland as kind of the reserve of traditional Irishness and so forth. But then he says that only takes you so far in decolonizing, and actually there's a point where you have to go beyond that, and you have to, like not you, but a culture has to reimagine itself in modernity. And he talks about the idea of being a nation but not being nationalist. And I think there's an idea which does unfold in Ireland about that, and I think it comes maybe in the 60s with Lamass, with this idea of opening up after the kind of protectionism of the 50s. But what's interesting is that there's lots of other countries, obviously right across the African continent, but also in South America and elsewhere, who've gone through very similar evolutions historically. We got to take a sort of expanded story of what we've just been discussing that looked at infrastructures right across the 20th century, starting with the appropriation of the postal infrastructure in 1916, but then with Ardna Crusher, and then right up to the present day, and the way that they operate symbolically. And it was quite interesting. We started looking at more recent ones in Ireland, like in the context of the Good Friday Agreement, we had, in the aftermath of that, we elected Mary McAleese to be our president. She said she was a builder of bridges. The symbolism of building the M1 was huge, and I think everybody understood the bridge across the Boyne and what that represented in that context. And it was very interesting that that was a decision taken by government and not by Louth County Council, like the naming of the bridge and so forth. So that what we thought was really interesting was to look at how the same thinking that applied to something like Ardnacrusha was still playing out at the end of the century and right up to the present day. And so we took an exhibition of this to the Venice Architecture Biennale. And what was interesting was the best response we got were from people from countries like Egypt. They got it immediately, whereas the British and French and Dutch didn't get it. And, you know, we understood that that was because they had ruled the world and they didn't know what it was like, actually, where, I mean, I think the insecurity that maybe goes with the, you know, some of the decisions, the anxiety that went some of the early decisions, is where you have major culture signifiers like language that have been erased effectively, like we're all here speaking English today. You know, how do you reimagine your identity within that, and how does that come about? And architecture, like lots of other things like stamps that have been referred to, and all sorts of things. I mean, there's a beautiful essay about W.B. Yeats about being on the committee that decided the new stamps. You know, and there's these amazing moments where people have to, and what we were able to find was we got British stamps that were overprinted in the first 6 months of the state before they had time to print new stamps. So they were literally, you know, had the king's head on them and it said Sairstad Éireann over the stamp, and it had been printed onto it. So the initial thing of painting postboxes green, and my local postbox still has Victoria Regina on it, you know, right through to the present day, where we're much clearer about this identity. I think that's been experienced in lots of places around the world, and it's an ongoing process. I mean, the current, I haven't been to see it, but the current Venice Architecture Biennale is all about decolonizing Africa, which is a huge, huge topic, you know.
One of the things that you're kind of just talking about, those like different projects of aspiration, and obviously like moments of radical change, change architecture as well, and they change large public projects or large infrastructure projects. And yet now there doesn't seem to be that public architectural vision for large scale infrastructure or large scale projects in the same way, which is kind of interesting. And it also raises the question around the colonialist part of, were there any discussions at the time of what an Irish architectural aesthetic would look like had colonialism not occurred? Because obviously there's a lot of mimicry in the repetition and replication of colonialist architectural tropes. Has that been anything that has been in the mix in an archive sense, or is there any evidence that there were those, I don't know, like Celtic futurist architectural conversations happening in the 1920s?
I mean, there was a lot of things that would have been in the Irish Builder and Engineer, where a lot of those architectural debates were going on in different articles, things. I think that they have a letters page as well.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of Irish architects were discussing these sort of ideas, and from quite early on as well, but also people going on architectural tours, particularly around Europe, going to the US, and bringing back ideas. I mean, you look at an awful lot of the Irish architects who are building in this time period, and they've gone on tours around Europe. They've gone looking at, you know, international style buildings. They've been to Finland. They've looked at the Paimo Sanatorium and come back and then worked on hospitals. And
there was a whole building program for sanatoria under Noel Brown that was inspired by that, and there was a lot of Dutch architects involved in that. And I think one of the things which is similar to what happened at Ardnacrusha was that very often there was importation of technology because we didn't have it within the island. Sometimes the buildings might have been designed by Irish practices, but often the kind of big piece of technology that they were serving was actually coming, like the German engineers. And I think, you know, that's in a way established this identity that we have as this now, as this kind of open sort of trading culture, as opposed to a kind of closed, insular culture. And I think that's maybe the thing that's really evolved in thinking in the century. So there's a speech by, I think it was Cosgrave, who's the president when they reopened the GPO, and he talks about how every material came from Ireland, every material. And there's no Portland stone in this building, in the reconstruction of this building. But actually, you know, our nature is hybrid. And I think it's interesting that because the problem of the outcome of the War of Independence and the Civil War meant that you could never have an insular culture because of the political border And you have to recognise the fact that it's not one single tribal identity. And I think that's been something we've really wrestled with historically. But actually now we're at a place where people accept that. And it means that there's no one way of being Irish. There are many. And that's a really good thing.
That's something I think that people have almost come back around to now, the last few decades. I know when I was writing the book, what I was thinking about was I had just spent a decade working in the IT industry and working for a company that was producing software for the United telephones in the United States and things like this. And there was lots and lots of sort of inward investment into the country and people coming in to work with us, but also then we were working on it in a very global setup, in a global world, and I remember being asked by somebody, you know, how do you sit that with being Irish? And it's like, well, they kind of nest with each other. I don't see any contradiction of that. Whereas the 1920s and 30s, I think they were trying to work that out, but still being stuck with these sort of opposites of you have to be this or that. You're either Irish or British. You're urban or rural. The idea of having multiple identities or sort of overlapping identities wasn't as common or as out there as it would have developed over the last
or politically
decades.
acceptable.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not that there wasn't, because there's apart from the two sides of the Civil War, you also have Labour Ireland, you've got Anglo-Irish Ireland, you have the start maybe of a technological Ireland with people working on Arda Crusha, places like that, and this sort of glimpse of what a technical or technological Ireland might be, but it sort of disappears then. It doesn't come back until the 90s.
The dominant thing about Ireland in the 1930s up into the 1960s is that we're poor. So while there are certain parts of the government trying to kind of grapple with these big issues, the reality is mass immigration. Which happened straight away. So after the Civil War, you see the mass emigration of the losers. So the anti-treaty side en masse start are forced to emigrate. And then you have a sense of the winners. So those who sided with the Free State are kind of looked after in the first 10 years. And then some of the lucky few come back from abroad, from America. People like Dan Breen. Dan Breen is running a saloon in 2nd Avenue in New York. And then gets a phone call and says, Fianna Fáil are now going to get into power, come back. And that starts to happen. But there still is this kind of sense of shame because we've won, we've defeated in the kind of the story that we tell ourselves, we have won our independence. But the reality is the emigration still continues. And projects and big projects that Don is talking about they're when they do happen, they're quite unique because everyone can see it because they don't happen too often. The fact that Arda Crusha is built in 5 years is, for the complexities of that kind of size of operation, is spectacular. And again, when we look now today at the Children's Hospital, which looks like, last time I went past, almost looks like it's finished. We seem to grapple when we kind of do big, huge projects, and they seem to take up a huge amount of debate in the newspapers and on social media today, but they don't happen too often, and they can be quite contentious.
Let's go back from the big to the small, and that thing around. The memory that certain sites, architectural sites, hold, and the clandestine and the hidden, but still kind of bordering the new state and so on, and the significance of Brendan Road. Obviously, you're kind of drawing from that in many ways, but a lot of people may not know about the significance of it. Can you both talk about that a little bit?
Well, I read the autobiography, and that one piece, that kind of one passage of Bat burying that money under the floor over 7 hours was just extraordinary to me, and it sat with me for years. And I didn't bring it to the new guys for a long time, and I just kept going back to it and stuff. And then myself and Genevieve went out and we did a site visit to Brendan Road, and Lara introduced us to somebody who lives on the road, and we got to see the interior of one of the houses. And then chatting to Lara about this was kind of the home of the revolution, I suppose, and kind of in some ways with a number of kind of key figures from the moment.
Yeah, I think it's kind of key to kind of nowadays when we kind of Donnybrook, when you drive past Donnybrook, you're going out into the suburbs. But Donnybrook in 1910 is a new suburb. When you drive out along Leeson Street, you're in Georgian Dublin. You go over the canal. you start to kind of go into an older kind of Georgian Dublin. But suddenly when you get around to the Burlington Hotel and in around that area, it's Victorian Dublin. So the point I'm making is that once the Act of Union happens, Ireland goes through an economic bust for 80 years. And the same thing happens over if you go onto the north side. If you go to Drumcondra, you can see going from the nice Georgian squares on the north side, suddenly you're in a Victoriana-type suburb. So Dublin is very small, and not much happens between 1800 to about 1880. There's an economic boom then from 1900 on, and Donnybrook is sort of kind of one of these many kind of red-bricked suburban areas. Battleconnor builds a series of houses on Brendan Road, and then number 1 Brendan Road is his house where he has his stash. It's also a safe house for Michael Collins and for a huge number of the IRA and the government leadership at the time. The Dáil itself purchases number 6, so they actually own a house on Brendan Road, which they buy off Battleconnor, which is strange. And then number 3 is owned by a family, and Susan Mason lives there, and she's one of Michael Collins's secretaries. So an area that you associate as a leafy suburb today is very much the centre of the revolution. And if you go around the corner onto a bigger road, which is Herbert Park Road, Owen MacNeill, the founder of the Irish Volunteers, lived in 1914. And the person living beside him was a gentleman called F.H. Browning. And Browning is the founder of the PALS battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And the first time I met Owen was working on PALS, the Irish in Gallipoli, which is a story about F.H. Browning's unit. Browning was too old to join the army, but he established the unit which went off to fight in Gallipoli and got massacred over there. So in this kind of small area, you start to see these kind of crossovers. Eamon de Valera lived on Merhampton Terrace, which is only about 200 metres from Battleconnor's house. And that's the house that he leaves on Easter Monday and goes off and fights in 1916. So it does prove how small Ireland is today, but also in particularly in 1916 and this period of the War of Independence and Civil War, that the people who are involved on both sides, as you were saying, those who associate with a kind of a strong unionist Dublin. And Dublin was very much 100 years ago a unionist city. And they're living side by side with the people who are involved, heavily involved in the revolution. It's all on top of each other, which I kind of find fascinating. And then as you go into the history of that street, a lot of other IRB people end up living in Battleconnor's houses. So there's a kind of a link going back to your links that a lot of these IRB people, the Irish Republican Army disappears in the 1920s, but you still have these kind of friendships that are clearly there on the street, which I'd love to delve into and find out more, but I haven't found out yet.
I wonder is like how D4 is used as a pejorative a lot of the time. Is that actually an ancestral memory of site of power? Or is it just because of RTEs?
I think it's just because of RTE from 1980s.
Cool. Glad we cleared that up.
And the fact they all drank in Madigan's pub.
Yes.
I think that was association with Dublin Forum.
Switching to really strange utopian, in heavy quotation marks, ideas. Circa, there was a bizarre ambition for a plan for a new Irish capital on the Hill of Tara. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, this is a little bit later than the time period we've been talking about this, and I have to admit, I know this because I supervised an undergraduate student's dissertation, Gavin O'Connor, who wrote about this. They're Altairi na Hasharga, and they're like soldiers of the revolution, and they were a very, very short-lived fascist party in Ireland in the 1940s. So they started in 1942 and they lasted for about 3 or 4 years, not very much longer. But one of their members was an architect who's later Dublin City architect, who's Dahi P. Hanley. And he had been commissioned by them to do a master plan for a new city, a new capital city for Dublin, for Ireland, that wouldn't be like decadent and urban and all of those things like Dublin, and that would be this new sort of Celtic Catholic, corporatist city based around the Hill of Tara, and the master plan was going to be a Celtic cross, the different things across it, which, funnily enough, never actually got built because the political
Yet.
party disappeared.
Let's do it.
They disappeared in pretty much around the end of the Second World War, but there was this whole idea of, we'll just build a new capital city, looking out to things like, I don't know, Chandigarh in India and Brasilia in Brazil, this idea of we'll get rid of the old city and we'll build this new one and we'll build it on these particular lines and theories. And this was an Irish example, so it's quite unusual.
Were there any other projects that express particular ideals or definitely were imaginative, shall we say, that never got off the ground or should have got off the ground that you're aware of in the 20s, 30s?
There's one I really love that did get off the ground, but it doesn't need to get off the ground anymore, which is the flying boat airport in the mouth of the Shannon. And actually, we had this in exhibition, and we found the drawing here in the National Archives, who were very kindly given it, or a copy of it to use. So it's a really interesting story where in the late 1930s, they didn't know whether the future of flying was airplanes or flying boats. They didn't know what way it was going to evolve. And the outcome of World War II, amongst others outcomes, was that it's airplanes. But it was kind of unclear. So when they started, the OPW did a master plan for Shannon Airport. And the reason why Shannon Airport is where it is because they had airside, landside, and waterside. So there's a harbour in the mouth of the Shannon for flying boats. And that the airport could function whichever way the technology evolved.
When you say flying boats, are you referring to like a seaplane scenario?
Seaplane,
or a
yeah,
Zeppelin?
but like
Okay,
transatlantic
right.
seaplanes.
Okay, cool.
That
Got
sort
it.
of scale of seaplane. So they thought that might be the way aviation would evolve. And they built it, and it's still there, but it's not used anymore. But I think it's that idea that we often think of course, airplanes land on runways. But actually, what's really interesting when you look at the century is how technologies themselves evolve and logistics evolve. So Ireland was like a really clear node in global aviation because of distances. And up until, I think it was sometime in the 1980s, transatlantic flights stopped in Shannon. At one point in the 1970s, both the American airlines and Aeroflot were refueling next to each other on the runway in Shannon, the height of the Cold War. So there's kind of really interesting things that come about which are to do with kind of logistical issues that then, despite the Cold War distance, meant that these people were literally sharing the same runway. But also that the just in terms of, I suppose, things that didn't get off the ground, that idea that actually it could have been quite different. We could all have been flying around in flying waterplanes and landing on the River Liffey or out in Dublin Bay,
Yeah, well, there's still time.
Yeah.
Right now, what do you think are like you've mentioned the Children's Hospital, but like what do you think are the, major imaginative architectural ideas in terms of large projects or types of projects for the 21st century state? I mean, there's massive toing and froing, endless repetitive conversations about offshore wind projects, for example. There's been a massive private rollout of data centres. I mean, probably one of the biggest industrial projects that has ever happened in this country that has happened very unnoticed, not by Airgrid, obviously, but what do you think are the big are things that we could put in a similar category or that we may have to in the next kind of 10, 20 years?
Housing.
Yeah.
Housing is the big problem in this country. It's huge, and I mean the state has pulled back from it hugely, and we've got a massive crisis. And you can't do anything without if people don't have a roof over their heads. So it really is a crisis. And there's they had a similar issue in France in the 1950s, and I can't remember which president it was, but he turned around to a minister, gave him an unlimited budget, and just said, "Sort this damn thing out," and they built like tons of housing, and that's what we need to do. Hopefully better than they did at that time, because a lot of it wasn't very good, but it needs to be done, and it's a really huge problem.
And thinking about how it can be done at scale as well, that it's not one house here, two houses here.
Yeah. The other challenge is Dublin. We can see it around this part of the city, Camden Street. People aren't living above shops. There aren't apartments or flats above the shops. And you're going along very old streets and you're seeing something on the ground floor, but nothing upstairs. And that's a challenge. And when you talk to people about it, there's fire risks. We need to put in extra fire escapes and all these other kind of complications. But other cities do this. You go to other cities, you go to New York, and people are living in buildings that are 150, 200 years old.
Of course,
they're being used. Here we're not doing that. And continuously, any surveys of kind of what they call the inner core, the area between the two canals, you're seeing a lot of derelict buildings. And that needs to be addressed. So there's kind of there's two elements. There's new builds that have to happen. And then going back to the original kind of, if you go back 50 years ago, the need for some sort of referendum on land ownership, because land rights, and you can see it again, even as from a child of the 1980s, there are still buildings in Dublin that were derelict when I was a kid in the 80s, which are still derelict. And my brother lives in New York. In New York, when you buy property in New York, you have 1 year to develop it. Otherwise, the city has rights to take the property off you. So in a city that you would associate with capitalism and kind of ruthless Wall Street people, you actually have a city that has rent controls, although they've been attacked over the last 20 years. And you also have a city where if they find a developer or a property owner is not doing something with a property, they will move in and they have rights which can't be defeated under constitutional law to take that property off you. So that's the kind of change that we need to see. And it has become, as you were saying, it's a huge crisis.
Yeah, or take 3 billion quid and incentivise every single office that's in a Georgian building to move into the empty contemporary purpose-built offices and return them to housing would be one.
And put in all those multiple approaches. I mean, it's not necessarily, Le Corbusier tower blocks outside Marseille, but it's things like that, that if you can use all of those different strategies and provide housing in lots of different ways, but rethinking it and being, trying to apply some more original thinking to it rather than necessarily, let's build more tower blocks or something like that. That it could be something, I'm just thinking about the 1920s and 30s houses, things like Marino and the Garden City, the whole idea of having, 2-story, they vary from like 2 to 3, 4 bedroom houses. They've got a garden in the front, they've a garden at the back. You can walk to the shops. It's the 15-minute city in a lot of ways. I know that's been in the news a lot, but this whole idea of setting up the layout of an area that the original idea of the Garden City is that it's got all the advantages of a rural life. It's got gardens, it's got lots of greenery, it's got parks, but also then it's got short distances and it's got all the advantages of the city. But to try and put them together, and even Marino today is incredibly desirable a place to live for all those reasons, even though the houses are 100 years old.
Final word before we grab some questions.
That's what I was thinking about when I was looking at kind of Ardna Crusher stuff. I was looking at it going, how could something so big and so ambitious be done in the 1920s? And I couldn't stop thinking about the housing crisis that we have now, and that it seems that there's no solution or there's no will to bring a solution or attempt to try. And you can see the city centre decaying, as you're saying, with all these empty kind of vacant spaces above and kind of communities being pushed out and being neglected and all that kind of stuff, So I think that looking back to that kind of period of ambition was just made me think of what was happening today, or even the children's hospital and all that kind of stuff.
I guess a housing crisis is one thing, a housing policy crisis and a housing crisis is another kind of thing that compounds it.
Yeah, and just the lack of foresight from stopping to build social housing in the 80s and just letting that decay, and just you see the results now, and it just makes me very angry,
Well, thanks so much for all of your amazing insights and expertise, Owen, Lara, Circa and John. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. There's a mic wandering around there,
Is this on?
It is.
Yeah. When Tom McLaughlin came back from Pomerania, he came back to a country that was governed by a very fiscally conservative and socially conservative government, W.T. Cosgrave's government. So who did he persuade, or how did he persuade this cabinet to undertake such a scheme? Because this scheme was one of the wonders of the world when it happened. There's an encyclopedia of the 1930s. I think Enid Blyton was the editor, and it's listed as one of the wonders of the engineering wonders of the world. Sorry, that's a big, long-winded question.
No, great question.
No, it is. And part of this is that Tom McLaughlin actually knew an awful lot of the members of the new government, including the Minister for, I can't remember if it was Trade and Industry or Industry and what the combination of the terms was. So he had personal connections with members of the government that he could actually go and talk to and basically convince them of that this was such a really good idea, and convince them that what it would do for the country in the long term as well. And I mean, part of it is one of these things about Irish politics, about who knows who. I mean, talking about people down the road from each other, left, right, and centre, that you're talking about people who might have been to college together, they might have grown up in the same area as well, that it's actually a very, very close-knit group of people. And they're the people that he's talking to and that he's convincing to sign up for this, to sign the country up for it as well.
But also Siemens are looking for international kind of contracts as well. They're actively looking at post-World War I to kind of start to get the company up and running again, because they're in quite difficult
He does become very frustrated with the ESB and with how things are, doesn't he?
Yes, because he ended up leaving Siemens and becoming the director of the ESB,
yeah.
and then leaving.
Yeah.
And
very much he was frustrated with the way things were running. He was frustrated with the way the country was going. And as a going away gift, he was given a model of Ardna Crusher in solid silver.
yes,
Which
lights up.
Which also lights up. And when I used to work for the National Museum, one of my first jobs was to go to England and buy it back, and it's with the ESB now in their offices. So if you ever have a chance, it's well worth seeing. It's an amazing piece of silver work, but also amazing work in relation to electricity.
An amazing piece of silver work by one of the silversmiths from Dublin.
Okay.
And I would need to check the name of the silversmiths company, but it was actually made in Dublin for this as a leaving gift.
Amazing. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks very much. I was very interested in the piece about kind of hybrid stuff and the GPO and those examples. I wonder if there's any others of dealing with old British-built heritage in the new Ireland, because I've been watching with interest. I'm not sure which Irish king has patronised the new Royal Dublin Convention Centre that went up on Ship Street, but we have a brand new royal building anyway. So how has the new Ireland been dealing with previous built heritage?
Well, it had to, I mean, John won't know more about the technical details, but it had to rebuild the city centre. So the whole of O'Connell Street had to be rebuilt, as did the Custom House, which was destroyed by the IRA. And then, of course, the Free State and the anti-treaty forces did a wonderful job on the forecourts and also the Public Record Office. So throughout the 20s and into 30s, all those buildings are being rebuilt. They're not being rebuilt the way they were. I mean, John will know more about this, but it's a lot of steel structure also. But from the outside, the facade is very much trying to retain the traditional look and feel of what the buildings were. But in relation to the Custom House, I mean, large parts of the interior were never rebuilt. It was very much the focus was on rebuilding the dome to give you the feel and look of it. But again, I'm sure it was down to cost also as one of the challenges.
Yeah, and also modernising. I mean, I think, for example, with the GPO itself, it was built, I think, in 1814. It had just been refurbished in about 3 weeks before the Rising, and then got completely gutted. And then when it was rebuilt, it was built with a steel frame, and there was quite a few things changed about it. There was a royal coat of arms in the tympanum, which is the triangular piece of the pediment. That was not restored in the reconstruction. There were various other things that were sort of changed about it. And I think that's quite interesting, but you get this, this is universal, it's not specific to Ireland. There's an amazing story in Paris at the time of the lead up to the revolution. King Louis XV commissioned this church that would reinforce his authority, dedicated to the patron saint of Paris, Saint Genevieve. By the time it actually got finished, it was 1790, and the revolution had already happened. And then they turned it into a temple for the great men of the revolution. They were all men at the time. And it's called the Pantheon. You can go and visit it in Paris. And they still have it as a temple to outstanding French citizens. Thankfully, they recently put Josephine Baker into it, so it's not all men anymore. But there's this idea that buildings, when Yeats talks about all changed utterly, it includes the buildings. And I think it's really interesting, like if you read Roman history or something, you get the same things happening. They're moving from a republic to empire to emperors. There's, and buildings and cities change over time. They're not sort of static things. And there's this, amazing thing that they embody within them history. They're actual physical artifacts of history. They're sort of, it's there as tangible heritage. And it's very interesting, the layering of it, and the fact that, for example, the Custom House has this Irish limestone where, in pure conservation terms, you would have wanted to see Portland stone, but there's a historical reason why it's not. That is in itself the story of the building. And, and likewise I love the modern piece on top of the Public Records Office, as a kind of a building going off in a different direction and how that happens. So this happens in cities all the time, and in countries, because of the way history evolves and happens. And, we can see obviously what's happening today in Ukraine, how our buildings get destroyed in wars, absolutely destroyed. It's like almost one of the first things that gets destroyed. So then what gets built back is different. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting how those things interact over time.
Anyone else? Good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for a stunning discussion, and just so much to enriching ideas there. I think you described very well, all of you, how the imperative to assert identity, the imperative to and a powerful client or client body is really important in the making of architecture or anything really expensive and physical. And then, so you described that very well. And then at the end, when you were asked what's our next, our big challenge, and everybody pretty much said housing. And then while there were some examples of how it might be addressed, of course, you are understandably flummoxed, as it seems we all are. I'm just wondering, is there anything that you could say, how do we come to apply a powerful, unified imperative and vision around housing in Ireland, given where we are today? Because, learning from all of the examples you've given, and the journey we've taken from being a colonised state to somewhere where, I don't know where exactly we are, but we're certainly somewhere, and our architecture is strong in Ireland.
Can I actually say something to that? Because I think the voice missing in the discourse around the crisis is actually the architect's voice and the voice of design and the voice of architecture. I think that the public and a lot of politicians are mired in the obstacles of their own creation with regards to policy. And I think that there's obviously a lack of imagination and there's a lack of vision. But I think one of the reasons that exists is that people can't actually see something tangible. And I sometimes wonder if there were really ambitious, beautiful, extraordinary plans, speculative or otherwise, actually presented to the public and to government, would something click over into that's a massive thing that we could do, rather than the piecemeal, interventionist, sticking plaster falls off, another thing, because all of that has really failed. And I think that there's like massive gaps in the public psyche with regards to what mass housing in a really, progressive way actually looks like. I would imagine that if tomorrow, like that was presented and like in a very, very visible way, that it would actually make something click into place. Maybe that's really naive, but...
Could I just say something on that? Because I think, there are examples, but it's not on the scale it needs to be. And I think, you can go down, Ali, you've been involved in that project on Dominic Street for social housing, which I think is absolutely marvellous.
On the east side.
On the east side,
Doing something really interesting on the west side.
Yeah. And you're involved in projects where you're refurbing some of our historic social housing as well.
Yeah.
And, there are really good people doing really good work,
Yeah, but I mean,
trying
like,
to do it, But in the difficulty of funding, and not having a kind of a clear, and I don't know exactly how this is playing out for you now today. I know how it played out when I worked in the public sector, but I'm assuming that there are all sorts of obstacles to getting that done, and it's difficult because there's not more of it happening.
I have a suggestion, actually, but I think it's, and I can see I can see little, shoots of this popping up. It's climate action.
Yeah.
And I do think that that the imperative to react to climate change is forcing us. I mean, we're very comfortable saying we need a new economic model. We need a new economic model. We also need a new aesthetic model.
Agreed.
We need a new sense of what buildings are. I mean, our climate crisis is a physical crisis. It might be derived from an intellectual crisis, an empathy crisis, but the reality is the problem is physical. We're destroying the planet, and physically. So architects also have to think about what is this new aesthetic, what is reimagine what is iconic, and. But I think that's the opportunity, because I think there's general agreement about the need to respond to climate change. And so architects could seize the initiative by coming up with really clever physical solutions.
That's something that I had seen. There was an exhibition in what used to be the Science Gallery that was run by the Irish Architecture Foundation recently, where they had gotten, I think, 10 or 12 different groups of architects to come up with their different solutions, none of which was going to solve everything, but it was really, really interesting. I brought a class of students to it, and it was really interesting to see some of those ideas and those debates manifested. That they were manifested in drawings and in models and in short films and things like that. But that physicality of it, where the students were like, "Oh, we could do this, we could do this,
No,
we could do this."
that was terrific. But I think it's a bit more fundamental than that. It's going back to the very materials we use. But it's look. All I'm saying is it's astonishing, even in the space of the last year, how people now are everybody's talking, and policymakers are all talking about climate change, climate action. Policies are coming at us thick and fast. So I do think that's an opportunity to actually reframe, to actually look towards solutions like housing, but through the lens of climate action, because everybody gets that.
Yeah, well, that's why using existing buildings is the smartest
But
thing.
also, new buildings in materials like timber can act as carbon sinks. And one of the issues we have, and I think it's before committee yesterday or today, was Dublin Fire Brigade, was the whole issue about, in Ireland, you can't build in timber over 3 stories under our fire regulations, but in other countries you can. So, like, I design private houses entirely in timber, but I can't design multi-unit dwellings entirely in timber because of those regulations. And that's something that you can do in Belgium or Scandinavia or America, Canada, but you can't do here, even though fire burns the same way. So I think, and there's understandable reasons why we have those very strict regulations in terms of our own history around that. But, if they can be thought about, and I think that's what's going on at the moment, is to try and review that. But we have very good companies. There's a cluster of companies down around Cork who make both timber frame at scale and who make CLT, which is a type of timber slab, and also glulam, which can be used for larger buildings. And those companies like I've been to some of their factories. They have modern methods of manufacture, digital work, factories and everything producing this stuff. But it can only be produced at a certain scale of the kind of housing estate. But if we can move to producing that at scale, we could start to have these buildings that would actually, instead of at the moment producing carbon in their construction, mainly through concrete, actually be sequestering carbon in their structures, which would be amazing.
Mm. One more question, if there's any. Brill, perfect. Thank you so much to yourselves for your attention and all of your questions, and for being here. Much appreciated, and to everyone in the archive who organised everything, and to the fantastic panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.